Welcome, and today we're just taking a brief look at Psalm 28. As I sometimes do in this series, let me just remind you, these are not meant to be detailed expositions covering every aspect of the psalm, just bringing out a few thoughts that hopefully will sum up the psalm and maybe whet your appetite for some further reflection and study. One thing that occurs to me as we look at Psalm 28 is that, generally speaking, we tend to see the psalms as relatively standalone units, without many connections from one psalm to the other. But sometimes it's helpful just to see if there are any comparisons and connections between psalms, particularly ones that come close to each other in the psalms, because it may well be that those connections were in the mind of the compiler of the Psalter when he put them together. And there are two interesting connections, I think, between Psalm 27 and Psalm 28. In Psalm 27 we saw this great sense of confidence that God has promised to hear the prayer of David, and twice in that psalm he speaks about speaking to God face to face. In Psalm 28 there's a real fear that God might not hear him and might turn a deaf ear to him, and so it's almost the opposite of that confidence in Psalm 27. Also in Psalm 27 and in verse 9 David prayed, "Do not sweep me away with the wicked," and in Psalm 28 he says in verse 3, "Do not drag me off with the wicked." So there's an element of continuity as well as contrast between these two psalms. But I just want to focus on two thoughts that strike me out of Psalm 28. First of all, there's the attitude in prayer. The attitude in prayer. I want you to notice three things that David speaks about that reveal his heart as he comes to God in prayer. First of all, there is that sense of being undeserving. Although often David pleads for vindication and a demonstration of his rightness in any particular situation, is never in a pharisaical legalistic sense. It's always in a sense of dependence on the mercy of God. And so he says here in Psalm 28 and verse 2, "Hear the voice of my plea for mercy. Don't treat me as I deserve, treat me out of your loving kindness." So there's a sense of being undeserving, and that's a necessary attitude as we come to God in prayer. "Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling." And then secondly, I want you to notice David's attitude of being jealous for the glory of God. He prays some pretty strong things here for his enemies. From verse 3 onwards, he says, "Give to them according to their work." He wants retribution on his enemies, who are effectively the enemies of God as well. He wants sinners to be punished. But it's not out of some maliciousness or hatred of the sinners. It's because of his jealousy for the glory and the honor of God. You see, if God says that sin will be punished and sinners escape punishment, God's glory is diminished and indeed dishonored. And God's glory is exalted and demonstrated when sin is punished and indeed when sinners are punished. So David is praying that God's honor and glory will be demonstrated and vindicated through the punishment of the wicked who get what they deserve because they live disregarding the glory of God. Now we have to be careful how we pray that prayer and for whom we pray that prayer, because we're not the anointed king of a theocratic nation like David was. But nonetheless, that motivation of the glory of God should be shot through in all our praying for the world and for others. And the third attitude I want you to notice is he says at the end of verse 2, "I lift up my hands toward your holy sanctuary." It was a normal practice, particularly among men in the Hebrew days, for men to pray with their hands outstretched toward God. It speaks about asking God for blessings that they can receive with their hands. But the point I want you to notice here is it's toward your holy sanctuary, your most holy sanctuary. And the language here suggests very strongly it's the idea of the Holy of Holies, which has two elements to it. It's the throne room of God, but it's also the mercy seat. So David is praying to God as his sovereign, but again also as the one on whom he is dependent for mercy. So there's the attitude in prayer. And lastly, and very briefly, I want you to notice his anticipation in prayer. Verse 6, "Blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the voice of my pleas for mercy." What doesn't come over clearly in the English translation is that in the original language, that is an anticipation of faith. It's not that he has yet answered in fact, it's that David knows that he has answered in principle. He's confident that his prayer has not fallen on deaf ears. God has not been deaf to him as he prayed in verse 1. And if God is deaf to him, he may as well be dead, says David. but he knows in his heart God has heard, God has answered. But like we saw again in Psalm 27, God's timing is normally very different from ours. The Lord bless you.